Lonely rancher bought a Apache girl traded for a sick horse, then gave her a name and a home. The wind howled across the Montana territory like a banshee, carrying with it the promise of an early winter that would test every soul brave enough to call this wilderness home. Thomas McKenna stood in the doorway of his weathered barn, watching his prize stallion Thunder struggle for each labored breath. The magnificent black horse lay on his side in the straw, his once powerful frame now a shadow of its former glory. At 38, Thomas had buried more dreams than most men twice his age. His weathered hands, scarred from years of ranch work and barbed wire, trembled slightly as he knelt beside Thunder. The stallion's eyes, once fierce and wild, now held the dull glaze of approaching death. Dr. Patterson from Billings had delivered the verdict with brutal honesty 3 days prior. Internal bleeding, possibly from a kick to the belly, certainly fatal. "Easy, boy," Thomas whispered, stroking the horse's neck. Thunder had been more than livestock. He'd been Thomas's constant companion through 3 years of bitter isolation, since consumption had claimed his young wife Mary and their infant daughter. In this harsh land where neighbors were separated by miles of unforgiving prairie, Thunder had been his only confidant. The sound of approaching riders cut through the morning air. Thomas squinted against the autumn sun, making out 4 figures on horseback emerging from the pine-covered hills. As they drew closer, he recognized the lead rider, Joseph Crow Feather, an Apache trader whose reputation for honest dealing had earned him grudging respect even among the most prejudiced settlers. "McKenna," Joseph called out, raising his hand in the universal gesture of peaceful greeting. Behind him rode 2 Apache braves and, most surprisingly, a young woman wrapped in a colorful blanket, her long black hair braided with beads that caught the sunlight. "Joseph," Thomas replied, stepping out of the barn. "You're a long way from the reservation." Joseph dismounted with fluid grace, his weathered features serious. "Word travels fast on the wind, my friend. They say your Thunder is dying." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Even his private grief couldn't remain hidden in this gossiping frontier community. "What's it to you?" "Perhaps we can help each other," Joseph said, gesturing toward Thunder's prone form visible in the barn. "That horse carries the bloodline of the cavalry mounts. Even dying, he has value to my people for what he might pass on." "Thunder's not going anywhere," Thomas said firmly, though even as the words left his mouth he knew they rang hollow. The horse was suffering, and his conscience wouldn't let that continue much longer. Joseph studied Thomas's face with the careful attention of a man who had survived by reading other men's souls. "You live alone on this land, McKenna. Winter comes early this year. A man needs help to survive what's coming. I've managed 3 winters on my own." "Barely," Joseph said without malice. "Your fence lines are falling, your roof needs patching, and your garden died from neglect. You're slowly dying just like your horse." The brutal honesty stung because it was true. Thomas had let the ranch deteriorate as his grief consumed him. What had once been a thriving homestead was becoming a monument to despair. "What are you proposing?" Thomas asked. Joseph gestured toward the young woman who remained mounted and silent. "She has no place among our people. Her husband died in a skirmish with cavalry soldiers last spring. His family blames her for bringing bad medicine. She cannot stay with us, but she has nowhere else to go." Thomas looked at the woman properly for the first time. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with strong features and intelligent dark eyes that held a familiar pain. Her clothes were well made but worn, and her hands, he noticed, bore the calluses of someone accustomed to hard work. "You're suggesting I trade my horse for—" Thomas paused, unsure how to phrase it without giving offense. "For help," Joseph finished. "She knows horses, can cook, mend, tend a garden. She asks only for shelter and food. In return, you get assistance surviving the winter and someone to help tend your land." "I don't need a woman complicating my life," Thomas said, though his protest sounded weak even to his own ears. "She's not a woman seeking a husband," Joseph clarified. "She's a survivor seeking a chance to live, like you." For the first time, the young woman spoke, her English clear but accented. "I can help your horse pass with honor. Among my people, I was known for easing the suffering of animals." Thomas felt something twist in his chest at the gentle certainty in her voice. Thunder deserved better than lying in agony while Thomas wrestled with his inability to end the animal's suffering. "What's your name?" Thomas asked her directly. She met his gaze steadily. "I have no name." My husband's people took it from me when they cast me out. If you accept this trade, you may give me a new one." The simple dignity in her words struck Thomas like a physical blow. To lose one's name among her people was to lose identity itself. She was offering him not just her labor, but her very existence to remake. Thunder whinnied weakly from the barn, a sound that tore at Thomas's heart. The stallion was suffering, and his stubbornness was prolonging that suffering. Meanwhile, this woman sat before him, nameless and homeless, offering to help him through the coming winter, in exchange for the dying horse that represented his last connection to better times. "If I agree," Thomas said slowly, "what exactly would be expected of both of us?" "You provide shelter, food, protection," Joseph replied. "She provides assistance with your ranch, your animals, your survival. Come spring, if either of you wishes to end the arrangement, she returns to us, and no dishonor falls on anyone." Thomas walked closer to the woman's horse. She didn't flinch or look away, meeting his examination with quiet courage. In her eyes, he saw the same hollowed-out grief that he carried in his own chest. "You understand what you're agreeing to?" he asked her. "This is harsh country. Winters here can kill. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and the nearest town is 15. You'd be isolated with a stranger." "I understand isolation," she replied simply. "I understand survival. I understand that sometimes strangers become family when blood family fails you." The wisdom in her words, spoken by someone so young, made Thomas realize that her suffering had aged her beyond her years, just as his had aged him. "Your horse is in pain," she added gently. "I can prepare medicines to ease his passing, or if there's hope, to help him heal. But first we must know which path his spirit wishes to take." Thomas looked back at Thunder, then at Joseph, and finally at the woman who sat patiently awaiting his decision. The choice felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, terrifying, but somehow necessary. "We have a deal," Thomas said, extending his hand to Joseph. As Joseph clasped his hand, sealing the arrangement, Thomas felt the weight of what he'd just committed to. He'd traded his dying horse for a nameless woman, and somehow, in this strange transaction, he sensed that both of their lives were about to change in ways neither could imagine. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the McKenna ranch as Joseph and his companions disappeared into the tree line. Thomas stood beside the young Apache woman, acutely aware of the awkwardness settling between them like dust after a storm. Her few possessions lay at her feet: a worn leather satchel, a bundle wrapped in faded cloth, and a small pouch that smelled of herbs and medicine. "I suppose we should start with your name," Thomas said, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. The woman stood perfectly still, her dark eyes taking in every detail of the ranch: the sagging porch, the patched barn walls, the overgrown vegetable garden that had once been Mary's pride. "What would you call me?" she asked, her voice carrying the cadence of someone translating thoughts from one language to another. Thomas rubbed his jaw, feeling the rasp of 3 days' worth of stubble. Naming another human being felt like a responsibility too weighty for his calloused hands. "That doesn't seem right, me choosing what you're called." "Then we have a problem," she replied with the faintest hint of what might have been humor. "Because I told you the truth. I have no name to give you." From the barn came Thunder's labored breathing, a sound that had haunted Thomas's sleep for days. The woman turned toward the sound, her expression shifting to one of professional concern. "May I see him?" she asked. "Before we worry about names, let's see about the horse that brought us together." Thomas led her into the barn, where Thunder lay in the straw-filled stall. The stallion's coat, once glossy black, had dulled with sickness, and his breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. The woman knelt beside the horse without hesitation, her hands moving gently over his neck and flanks with the practiced touch of someone who understood animal suffering. "How long has he been down?" she asked, her fingers finding the pulse point behind Thunder's jaw. 2 days, Thomas replied, crouching beside her. This close, he caught the scent of sage and wood smoke that clung to her clothes. Before that, he was refusing food for nearly a week. She continued her examination in silence, her hands exploring Thunder's belly with gentle pressure. The horse didn't flinch or struggle, seeming to understand that her touch carried healing intent rather than harm. "There," she said softly, her palm resting just behind Thunder's ribs. "Do you feel that?" Thomas placed his hand next to hers, feeling the unnaturally firm swelling beneath the skin. What is it? Something inside is bleeding, as your doctor said. But, she paused, pressing slightly different spots along Thunder's side. I don't think it's what he thought. This feels like a blockage, not a tear. Hope flickered in Thomas's chest like a candle flame in wind. You mean he might live? Perhaps. Among my people, we have seen horses with twisted intestines, blocked passages. Sometimes they can be helped, but it requires patience and the right medicines. She looked up at Thomas, her dark eyes serious. It will take days of constant care, and there's no guarantee. Thomas felt the weight of decision settling on him again. Doctor, Patterson had been certain Thunder was dying, and the kindest thing would be to end his suffering quickly. But this woman spoke with quiet confidence about possibilities the white doctor hadn't considered. What would you need? Thomas asked. Time. Certain plants, some I brought with me, others I must find here. And you must trust me, even when what I do seems strange to your ways. Thunder's breathing hitched, and both of them turned their attention back to the suffering animal. The woman began humming softly, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to calm the horse almost immediately. Ayana, Thomas said suddenly. The woman stopped humming and looked at him questioningly. Your name, Thomas explained, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. Mary, my wife, she had a book about different tribes, their languages. Ayana means eternal blossom in Cherokee, I think. It seems like it fits. The woman, Ayana, was quiet for so long that Thomas began to worry he'd overstepped some cultural boundary. Finally, she nodded slowly. Ayana, she repeated, as if testing how the name felt in her mouth. Eternal blossom. Yes, I think that will do. It speaks of survival, of continuing to grow even in difficult ground. Relief flooded through Thomas, though he couldn't quite understand why her approval mattered so much to him. Good. That's settled then. Ayana returned her attention to Thunder, beginning to unpack items from her medicine pouch. Thomas watched as she laid out various dried herbs, small clay containers, and what appeared to be carved bone implements. I'll need hot water, she said, selecting several of the herbs, and clean cloths. Also, do you have honey? Some, Thomas replied. Mary kept bees before. He trailed off, surprised by how easily he'd mentioned his dead wife to this stranger. If Ayana noticed his discomfort, she didn't show it. Honey helps healing, draws out bad spirits from wounds. We'll need it for what comes next. As Thomas gathered the requested supplies, he found himself studying Ayana with curious eyes. Her movements were economical and purposeful, each action serving a specific function in her treatment of Thunder. She mixed herbs with the practiced ease of someone who had been healing animals since childhood. Where did you learn all this? Thomas asked, returning with a pot of heated water and his dwindling supply of honey. My grandmother, Ayana replied, adding herbs to the steaming water. She was medicine woman for our band. Said the spirits spoke through her hands when animals were hurt. She paused, stirring the mixture with a wooden stick. I don't know if spirits guide me, but I know what works. The barn filled with the sharp, clean scent of the medicinal tea Ayana was preparing. Thunder's breathing seemed to ease slightly, though Thomas couldn't tell if that was wishful thinking or genuine improvement. This is going to take time, Ayana said, settling cross-legged beside Thunder's head. Days, maybe a week. I'll need to stay with him, especially tonight. Thomas felt a stab of uncertainty. You mean sleep in the barn? Yes. Critical time for healing is when the world sleeps. I must be here to guide him through the dark hours. The practical implications of their arrangement were beginning to sink in. Thomas had a strange woman living on his property, sleeping in his barn, and he realized he had no idea how this was supposed to work. What did she eat? Where would she sleep when Thunder recovered? How were they supposed to share the same space without impropriety? There's a room in the house, Thomas said awkwardly. Mary's sewing room. It has a bed. You could sleep there when you're not tending Thunder. Ayana looked up from her preparations, studying his face with those intelligent dark eyes. You're having second thoughts about this trade. It wasn't a question, and Thomas found himself appreciating her directness. Maybe. I haven't lived with another person in 3 years. I'm not sure I remember how. Good, Ayana said, surprising him. Honesty makes things simpler. I haven't lived anywhere but with my husband's hostile family for 2 years. I've forgotten how to trust, how to feel safe. We're both learning. Her frankness eased something tight in Thomas's chest. At least they were both uncertain, both fumbling through unfamiliar territory. There are rules we should agree on, Thomas said. Boundaries so we both know what's expected. Ayana nodded, continuing to prepare her medicines. What rules do you think we need? Thomas had been thinking about this since Joseph and his companions had ridden away. We keep separate spaces in the house. We take meals together, seems foolish to cook separately. We share the work according to our strengths. And he paused, unsure how to phrase the most important boundary. And we remain respectful of each other's grief. Ayana finished quietly. You're still mourning your wife. I'm still mourning my husband. Neither of us is ready for anything beyond partnership and survival. Exactly, Thomas said, grateful she understood without him having to stumble through an explanation. Thunder whinnied softly, drawing their attention back to the immediate crisis. Ayana began administering her prepared medicine, coaxing the horse to drink the herbal mixture despite his weakness. Will you tell me about him? Ayana asked as she worked. How you came to have such a fine horse. Thomas found himself describing Thunder's lineage, how he'd traded 2 years' worth of cattle to acquire the stallion, how he and Mary had planned to build their ranch around Thunder's bloodline. As he talked, Ayana listened with genuine interest, asking occasional questions that showed she understood horses as well as she claimed. The sun set while they worked together over Thunder, and Thomas lit the oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the barn walls. For the first time in 3 years, his evening wasn't spent in solitary silence. Instead, he found himself part of a quiet partnership focused on saving a life. He's stronger already, Ayana observed as Thunder managed to lift his head slightly. The medicine is reaching the blockage. Tomorrow we'll know if it can be cleared. Thomas looked at the woman who had appeared in his life, like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. Ayana knelt beside his dying horse, her hands gentle and sure, her presence filling spaces in his world that he'd forgotten were empty. Thank you, he said simply. Ayana glanced up at him, and for the first time since her arrival, she smiled, a small, cautious expression that transformed her entire face. Thank you for giving me a name, Thomas McKenna, and for giving me a chance to prove it fits. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Montana territory, painting the sky in shades of pewter and rose. Thomas woke to the unfamiliar sound of movement in his kitchen, the soft clatter of pans, the whisper of kindling catching fire. For a moment, he lay still in his bed, disoriented by the presence of another human being in his home after 3 years of solitude. He dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where he found Ayana tending a pot of coffee over the wood stove. Her long black hair was braided back from her face, and she'd changed from her traveling clothes into a simple brown dress that he recognized as one of Mary's garments from the trunk in the sewing room. I hope you don't mind, Ayana said, noticing his gaze. My other dress needs washing, and this was... She gestured helplessly at the familiar fabric. It's fine, Thomas said, though seeing Mary's dress on another woman stirred complex emotions in his chest. How's Thunder? Ayana's face brightened with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. Come see. They walked to the barn together, Thomas's boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. Inside, Thunder was standing in his stall, his head lowered to drink from a bucket of water. The transformation was remarkable. Where yesterday the stallion had been dying, today he showed unmistakable signs of recovery. The blockage cleared around midnight, Ayana explained, unable to keep the pride from her voice. Much fluid came out, very bad smelling. But after that, he began to improve quickly. Thomas approached Thunder's stall, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. The horse lifted his head and nickered softly, a sound Thomas hadn't heard in weeks. Thunder's eyes, clear and alert, tracked Thomas's movement with familiar intelligence. You did this, Thomas said, turning to Ayana with wonder. Dr. Patterson said he was dying for certain. Sometimes white medicine sees only one path, Ayana replied diplomatically. Apache medicine looks for different ways around the same mountain. Thomas reached out to stroke Thunder's neck, marveling at the warmth and strength he felt there. The horse was still weak, but the spark of life had returned to his eyes. What do we do now? Light food for several days. Warm mash, sweet hay, clean water. No riding for at least 2 weeks, maybe more. His insides need time to heal completely. As they worked together preparing Thunder's breakfast, Thomas found himself stealing glances at Ayanna. In the morning light, wearing Mary's dress and moving with quiet competence through the barn chores, she seemed less like a stranger and more like someone who belonged in this place. "You know," Thomas said as they walked back toward the house, "I never asked what happened to your husband. Joseph said he died in a skirmish with soldiers." Ayanna's steps faltered slightly, and Thomas immediately regretted the question. They had agreed to respect each other's grief, and here he was prodding at her wounds. "You don't have to answer that," he said quickly. "No, it's all right," Ayanna replied, though her voice carried new tension. "His name was Nalnish. It means he works. He was a good man, a skilled hunter. Last spring, some young men from our band decided to raid a supply wagon. Nalnish tried to stop them, said it would bring trouble to our people." She paused at the porch steps, her hand gripping the wooden railing. "The soldiers came to our camp looking for the raiders. There was confusion, fear." Nalnish stepped forward to explain that not all of us were involved. A young soldier, nervous and frightened, shot him before anyone could speak. Thomas felt anger rise in his throat. "And his family blamed you? They said I should have kept him inside our lodge, that a good wife would have stopped him from trying to make peace. They said my presence brought bad medicine that got him killed." Ayanna's voice remained steady, but Thomas could see the pain in her rigid posture. "Perhaps they were right. Perhaps I should have found a way to stop him." "That's foolish talk," Thomas said firmly. "A man who tries to make peace, who tries to protect his people, that's a man worth honoring, not blaming his widow for his courage." Ayanna looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such understanding from a white rancher. "You sound like you know something about carrying blame that isn't yours to carry." Thomas leaned against the porch railing, his own memories rising unbidden. "Mary died in childbirth. The baby too. A girl we were going to name Hope. I keep thinking about all the things I could have done different. Should have taken her to Denver to a real doctor instead of trusting the midwife. Should have built a better house, kept her warmer, fed her better. And would any of that have changed what happened?" Ayanna asked gently. "Probably not, but knowing that and feeling it are different things." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who understood the weight of survivors' guilt. The morning air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and Thomas realized this was the first time in 3 years he'd shared his real feelings about Mary's death with another person. "I think," Ayanna said finally, "that's why we were brought together. Not just for the horse, not just for winter help. Sometimes the spirits, or God, as you might say, they put broken people together so they can heal each other." The insight struck Thomas as profoundly true. "Is that Apache wisdom?" "That's Ayanna wisdom," she replied with a small smile. "I'm learning to tell the difference." They spent the morning working side by side, establishing the rhythms of shared domestic life. Ayanna proved to be an excellent cook, transforming Thomas's simple supplies into meals that actually had flavor. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, mending torn curtains, organizing neglected corners, bringing order to spaces that had fallen into bachelor chaos. "You don't have to do all this," Thomas said, finding her scrubbing his kitchen floor on her hands and knees. "I need to feel useful," Ayanna replied without looking up. "For 2 years, I was told I was worthless, that I brought nothing but trouble. Let me prove to myself that isn't true." Thomas understood that need. After Mary's death, he'd thrown himself into ranch work partly to prove he could still accomplish something, even if he'd failed to save his wife and child. In the afternoon, they walked Thunder around the corral, letting him stretch his legs while keeping him from overexertion. The stallion moved with increasing confidence, and Thomas felt hope growing in his chest like a plant reaching toward sunlight. "He'll be strong again," Ayanna said, watching Thunder with professional satisfaction. "Maybe stronger than before. Sometimes healing from great sickness leaves the body more resilient. Is that true for people too?" Thomas asked. Ayanna considered this seriously. "I hope so. We'll find out together, I think." As the sun began to set, they sat on the porch, sharing a simple dinner of stew and cornbread. The mountains glowed purple in the distance, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Thomas realized he felt more peaceful than he had since Mary's death. "Tell me about your ranch," Ayanna said. "What were your plans before you lost your family?" Thomas found himself describing his dreams. The horse breeding program he'd wanted to start with Thunder, the cattle operation he'd hoped to build, the community he and Mary had imagined creating in this wild country. As he talked, those abandoned dreams seemed less like painful memories and more like possibilities that might someday be revisited. Good dreams, Ayanna said when he finished. Dreams that could still happen, maybe in different ways than you first imagined. What about your dreams? Thomas asked. What did you want before your world changed? Ayanna was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I wanted children. A house full of children, with Nalnish's strong hands and quick mind. I wanted to teach them the old ways while helping them learn the new world that's coming whether we like it or not. You're still young, Thomas said gently. That dream isn't necessarily gone, isn't it? Ayanna's laugh held no humor. I'm a widow with no family, no place in my own people's world. What man would want to marry someone who brings such bad medicine? A man with sense, Thomas said firmly. A man who could see past superstition to the woman underneath. Ayanna looked at him with something that might have been gratitude. You're kinder than you know, Thomas McKenna. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the land. Thomas realized that for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't dreading the lonely hours before sleep. Instead, he was thinking about tomorrow, about Thunder's continued recovery, about the winter preparations he and Ayanna would tackle together, about the strange new shape his life was taking. Ayanna, he said as they prepared to go inside, I want you to know, this arrangement, it's not just about helping me through the winter anymore. You belong here now, for as long as you want to stay. She turned to face him in the lamplight, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered. For the first time in 2 years, I feel like I might have a home again. As they said goodnight and went to their separate rooms, Thomas realized that healing Thunder had been just the beginning. Somehow, in saving his horse, Ayanna had started the process of saving them both. November arrived with the fury of a wounded beast, bringing with it the kind of blizzard that old-timers would talk about for decades. Thomas woke to the sound of wind howling around the house like a living thing, rattling windows and driving snow through every crack in the walls. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees overnight, and frost covered the inside of the kitchen windows in delicate, deadly patterns. Thomas! Ayanna's voice called from the barn, barely audible over the storm's roar. He pulled on his heaviest coat and fought his way through knee-deep snow to find her struggling to calm the animals. Thunder, now fully recovered and magnificent in his strength, paced nervously in his stall alongside the 2 milk cows and handful of chickens that comprised Thomas's modest livestock. The roof, Ayanna shouted over the wind. There's a leak over the feed storage. Everything will be ruined if we don't stop it. Thomas looked up to see water dripping steadily through a gap where the wind had peeled back part of the tin roofing. In this cold, that water would freeze within hours, expanding the gap and potentially bringing down a section of the barn roof. I'll have to get up there, Thomas yelled back, though the thought of climbing onto a roof in this weather made his stomach clench with fear. Not in this wind, Ayanna replied firmly. You'll be blown off and killed. We need another way. For the next 2 hours, they worked together to save what they could of the feed, moving sacks of grain and bales of hay to the dry side of the barn, while rigging a canvas tarp to catch the worst of the leak. It was exhausting work made more difficult by the bitter cold and the constant need to shout over the storm. By afternoon, the wind had intensified further, and Thomas realized they were facing something more dangerous than an ordinary blizzard. This was the kind of storm that killed people, that left frozen bodies to be found when the snow melted in spring. We need to bring the animals into the house, Ayanna said, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The barn won't hold if this wind gets much stronger. Thomas stared at her in disbelief. The animals? In the house? Better animal mess than frozen animals, she replied practically. And better warm bodies than frozen people. We need their heat to survive. The wisdom of her words became clear as they struggled to lead Thunder and the cows through the connecting door Thomas had built between the barn and the kitchen. The large animals filled the main room of the house, their body heat immediately raising the temperature by several degrees. The chickens roosted on the backs of chairs, and Thomas found himself sharing his home with a barnyard menagerie that would have horrified Mary, but somehow felt perfectly natural with Ayanna managing the chaos. My grandmother survived the winter when soldiers burned our village, Ayanna explained as she spread straw on the floor for the animals. She said the difference between living and dying was often just being willing to do what seemed impossible. As night fell, the storm reached its full fury. The wind screamed around the house with such force that the walls shook, and Thomas began to worry about the structural integrity of the building. Snow drove horizontally past the windows, and the cold seeped through every gap despite their efforts to seal them. They huddled together near the wood stove, sharing blankets and body heat while the animals formed a protective circle around them. Thunder stood closest to the humans, his massive presence both comforting and reassuring. "Tell me about your grandmother," Thomas said, partly to distract himself from the terrifying sounds of the storm, partly because he genuinely wanted to know more about the woman who had shaped Ayana's strength. Ayana's voice took on the cadence of a storyteller as she described her grandmother's life, the old woman's marriage to a chief, her role as healer and wisdom keeper, her fierce determination to preserve Apache traditions, even as the world changed around them. "She used to say that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest," Ayana said, her words barely audible over the wind. "It was about being the most adaptable. The willow tree bends in the storm while the mighty oak breaks." "Smart woman," Thomas replied, pulling the blanket tighter around both of them. In the flickering light of the oil lamp, Ayana's face was serene despite the chaos around them. He found himself studying the curve of her cheek, the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her skin, the small scar above her left eyebrow that he'd never noticed before. "Thomas," Ayana said softly, and he realized she'd caught him staring. "Sorry," he mumbled, feeling heat rise in his cheeks despite the cold. "Don't be sorry," she replied, her dark eyes meeting his directly. "I've been looking at you too, wondering what it would feel like to not be alone anymore." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, and he became acutely aware of how close they were sitting, how her warmth seemed to seep through the layers of clothing and blankets. "Ayana," he said carefully, "we agreed we weren't ready for anything beyond partnership. That was 2 months ago," she replied. "Before you gave me a name and a place to belong, before I helped save Thunder and you helped save me. People change, Thomas. Hearts heal, even when we think they never will." Thunder chose that moment to nicker softly, as if adding his opinion to the conversation. Despite the gravity of the moment, both Thomas and Ayana smiled at the horse's apparent commentary. "What are you saying?" Thomas asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "I'm saying that maybe we've been healing each other all along without realizing it. I'm saying that when I look at you now, I don't just see the man who traded for me. I see the man who gave me dignity when I had none, who treats me as an equal, who makes me laugh and feel safe and valued." Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, like ice breaking up in spring. "I care about you too, Ayana, more than I thought I could care about anyone again. But I don't want to dishonor Mary's memory or take advantage of your situation or—" Ayana placed her hand gently over his mouth, stopping his words. "Your Mary would want you to be happy, wouldn't she? She would want you to live, not just survive." The simple truth of it hit Thomas like a physical blow. Mary had been generous and loving, and she would have hated to see him waste away in grief. She would have wanted him to find companionship, to rebuild his life, to honor their love by being willing to love again. "And my situation," Ayana continued, "is that I'm a grown woman who's chosen to stay here, who's chosen you. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I want to be." The storm raged around them, but inside the house, surrounded by animals and warmed by shared body heat, Thomas felt a different kind of storm brewing, one of possibility and hope and the terrifying prospect of opening his heart again. "If we do this," he said slowly, "there's no going back. Come spring, when Joseph returns, you couldn't leave even if you wanted to. People would talk, make assumptions. Let them talk," Ayana said firmly. "I'm tired of living my life according to other people's fears and prejudices. I want to live according to my own heart." Thomas studied her face in the lamplight, seeing determination mixed with vulnerability, courage tempered with hope. This woman who had appeared in his life like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying, was offering him something he'd thought lost forever, the chance to build a life with someone who understood his struggles and shared his dreams. "Ayana," he said, reaching up to touch her face gently, "I think I'm falling in love with you. "I think I fell in love with you the day you gave me a name," she replied, leaning into his touch. "I just wasn't ready to admit it to myself." Their first kiss was gentle and tentative, two wounded souls testing the waters of affection. But as the storm raged outside and the animals settled around them, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not just desire, but genuine happiness. When they finally pulled apart, Ayanna smiled with a radiance that seemed to light up the entire room. "So, Thomas McKenna, are you asking me to be your wife?" "I'm asking you to be my partner in everything," Thomas replied. "My wife, my best friend, my fellow dreamer. I'm asking you to help me build the life we both thought we'd lost." "Then yes," Ayanna said, sealing her answer with another kiss. "Yes to all of it." Thunder whinnied softly again, and they both laughed, recognizing the horses' apparent approval of their decision. Outside, the storm continued its assault. But inside, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances had discovered that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most difficult ground. As they settled back into their shared blankets now as an engaged couple rather than cautious partners, Thomas realized that this storm, which had threatened to destroy everything, had actually become the catalyst for the most important decision of his life. Sometimes he thought you had to weather the worst tempest to appreciate the calm that followed. The blizzard raged for 3 more days, but Thomas and Ayanna barely noticed. They were too busy planning their future, sharing their stories, and discovering that love, like the hardy plants that survived Montana winters, could bloom even in the harshest conditions when tended with patience and care. When the storm finally passed and the sun emerged to illuminate a world transformed by snow, Thomas McKenna was no longer the lonely rancher who had traded his dying horse for a nameless woman. He was a man preparing to marry his best friend, to build a life that honored both their pasts and embraced their shared future. And Thunder, fully recovered and magnificent in the morning light, seemed to approve of it all. What did you think of Thomas and Ayanna's journey from strangers to soulmates? Which moment touched your heart the most? When he gave her a name, when she saved Thunder, or their confession during the blizzard? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this frontier love story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more compelling tales from the Old West. Your support means everything.